I've called this lecture the Parvenu Princesses and given it this name because it's the way in which the British, of course, looked at the Bonapartes. And the way in which we look at much of the Napoleonic legend really comes down to us from the British, was their antagonism to Bonaparte, and also because of particular divisions in Britain at the time between the Whigs and the Tories. The Whigs weren't in agreement about the way in which Napoleon was treated, the way in which he was placed in St Helena, and indeed, as we'll see, people such as the Duke of Hamilton, the Duke of Devonshire, Lord and Lady Holland, all of that particular group actually used to go down and visit Caroline Bonaparte when they were in Naples, and also Pauline Bonaparte networks them as well to try and get better treatment for her brother. So part of this ferocious sort of campaign that you have by the British is also not so much, well, it is turned against the French, but it is also because of internal political problems. But I thought it's sort of very much this idea of rank being so important, of course, to the British. You know, they were called parvenus because they just arrived. But they also attempted to blacken Napoleon's reputation through his sisters. All these scurrilous accusations of incest and all this sort of thing. But in many ways, the way in which they blackened them couldn't have been worse than the way in which particularly his younger sister treated him at the end of his life. Now, last week, I had a number of phone calls from people actually asking me who was who and what was what and what happened when. And so I thought from the point of view of this lecture and for the next lecture and for when you actually go to the exhibition itself, it would be very, very useful to have not exactly a timeline, but a development of his career, because I noticed that I was talking about the first abdication and the second abdication, and a certain amount of eye glazing was going on. I can see you from here, don't think I can. So I thought I'd have a 20-minute whiz through Napoleon's career. And I'm not going to mention here some of his greatest achievements, which were, of course, off the battlefield, such as the civil code, the total reorganisation of the banking system, the metric system, the education system, and so on and so forth. I just want to get the main structure of his career. Well, as you know, he was born in 1769 in Corsica, which had just become French. In fact, it had only become French 3 months before. Known as Napoleon Bonaparte, who is an Italian speaker, and will only learn to speak French at the age of 10. And he and many of his siblings continued to speak French with quite a heavy Italian accent. Now, an Italian accent is not acceptable in French, right? Some accents the French will accept and they won't. The Italian one, mainly because it's so relaxed and they roll the sounds around in their mouth a lot, whereas French is a nervous, static, high-pitched language, and it doesn't come over when you have a relaxed style. All right, the Germans speak French particularly very well because they've got that staccato style. So in many ways, one of the things that people are going to use to make fun of the Bonaparte sisters is in particular their accent. And in particular, we've talked about Madame Mère, you know, when she was asked, are you proud of your son? And this pour vous que ça dure, you know, because they can't get the U sound of French. Who can? All right, so we have Napoleon then. Remember that there was this problem of his father fighting with Pauline for the independence of Corsica. Finally, when the French take over, his father changes, shoulders, or his gun, but to the different shoulder, and collaborates with the French, and is so successful with sort of toadying to the French consul in Corsica that he gets scholarships for his 4 eldest children to go and study in France. This is very important. And so he sends the elders, Joseph, then Napoleon and Lucien, and then the other one, Elisa, which is very interesting that he considered it important that a girl should have this kind of education, and that will mean a great deal in the way in which she is capable of administering the fiefdom that she is given by Napoleon. So Napoleon, at the age, he's very young, goes over, I think he's about 10 actually, would that be right? Yes, at the age of 10, goes and studies at Autun for several months before then being pitched into the military school at Brienne. Now, he is a lonely child, he's made fun of. This is a sort of a famous sort of, sketch of what happened. All the people who went through military school, even at this time, we're now talking at the time of the Revolution, were people from aristocratic families. And they were beautifully dressed. They had a big allowance, and they sort of thought this scrawny little fellow with his silly accent and his very sort of threadbare clothes was laughable. And he was certainly bullied. As one of the reasons he actually said on several occasions, "I'll get my own back against these French." And at one stage, he actually even attempted suicide. In fact, he attempted suicide twice. There's this almost manic side, depressive side of Napoleon that's not really spoken about very much. He was usually up, but he did have his downs. And this actually illustrates this sort of famous sort of episode, which is, probably didn't exist, but anyhow, Napoleon puts it forward when finally he's accepted by his mates when they have a snowball fight and they're all making, tactical errors, and he steps in and organises his side and they win hands down. Anyway, but this is the story. But he actually sort of is very much a bookish child, reads the classics, and these classics he'll take with him to the battlefield. Now, he graduates brilliantly. His teachers there, sort of, marked on his scorebook and says, will go a long way, should go into the Navy, very good at mathematics. He doesn't. He's sent up to the École Militaire, which of course is near the Eiffel Tower. This is what it looked like at the time. This is what it looks like today. It had been started by Madame de Pompadour under Louis XV for the sons of the aristocracy. So from these, at Brienne, he'd been in these freezing little rooms with no heating, food almost like out of a prison camp. It's a horrible place if you actually go and visit it, and it's quite possible that he contracted tuberculosis there. He certainly had a form of TB at some stage. Anyhow, he can't believe his luck when he finally comes to the École Militaire. There are servants, there's this extraordinary environment. But by this stage, of course, his mother, there's all the problems been in Corsica, and his mother, his father's dead, has to get out of Corsica, and he actually organises for her to come and live in the south of France, around Marseille, with his younger siblings. And he realises he hasn't got the luxury, really, of spending the amount of time that he would need to get through to graduate to be an officer, because he has to support his family. Right? Joseph's not pulling his weight and so on. So he actually gets through it 2 years at a time, all right, and comes out not at the top, but, in a respectable rank. So he's now decided that, of course, he's going to be in the École Militaire, not in the Navy. And there is, again, another story, which is not apocryphal, that he had put his name forward to be in the La Pérouse expedition organised by Louis XVI to Australia, and was turned down, basically because he didn't have quite the kind of background that they wanted. He had worked much more in mathematics. And so his mathematical training is going to push him as a very low-grade officer into the army. Now, it just so happens that at this time, we're still at the time of the Revolution, and you have to remember that right up until the time when he takes over from when he's returned from Egypt, he is a general of the Revolutionary Army, right? He's still Citizen Bonaparte. He only becomes Napoleon when he is crowned, right? So during the time of the Revolution, there is in the south of France considerable royalist support, all right, in the Vendée and particularly in the south. And there's an uprising which is helped by the British and the Spanish fleet, which come into the port of Toulon. And it looks as though they're going to be able to take the fort. And they call Napoleon in, who starts to try and organise things. He's overridden. And finally, because of his connections at the École Militaire and other places with the younger brother of Robespierre, Augustin Robespierre, and another patriot from Corsica, he is allowed to take a higher rank and organise the defence of Toulon. And it's at this point that his career takes off. He shows all the talents that he will later, this thinking outside the square, tactical errors, putting people here, there and everywhere. Everyone else was incompetent. He actually went and got the guns himself, and then we found that people couldn't work the artillery. He actually trained them himself, did absolutely all of these things. And won the day. The British had been ordered or had decided that they were going to, if they lost, they would destroy the port of Toulon, blow up the arsenal and blow up the French fleet. Nice lot. All right, so at the time then, just after this, we get the fall of Robespierre, all right, at the end of the Terror. And Bonaparte, because of his connections with Augustin, Robespierre, is imprisoned for a very short time. It's suspected that he is too close to these extremists. He manages to get out of prison and sets about working with what is now in place, which is called the Directoire. All right, so you've gone through the revolution, through the reign of terror under Robespierre. The fall of Robespierre, these 5 directors come in to take over. And the most important one is Barras, and it is he, remember we looked at last week, is the person who is going to introduce Bonaparte to Josephine. Josephine had been his mistress. He found her expensive, frivolous, and really sort of, wanted to get rid of her to some degree. So this is where sort of young Bonaparte meets and falls in love with Josephine. I mean, you hate these sort of, ghastly romantic stories, but it really, on his part, that's exactly what it was. He was absolutely bowled over by this older woman. Now, during this time, he's felt that he actually wasn't given enough position or praise for the key role that he played at Toulon. He was promoted a little bit, but not quite what he wants. So he tends to go on leave, and then he goes back to Corsica, is more involved with Corsican politics, comes back, and in fact he's even threatened with losing his rank because he's been on leave for so long. He has this idea that he's been chosen by destiny, and this is sort of something that is very strong and drives Napoleon. He's not someone who has any religious beliefs at all. He thinks all religions are the same, but he has this sense that he is someone different, and he actually has these sayings such as, great men light up history like comets, but burn out when their country, when history no longer has any need for them, and all of these other sayings such as glory is fleeting, obscurity is eternal, wonderful pithy statements, but sees things very clearly, that there is a moment to be taken, to be grabbed. There is a tide in the affairs of men. He really sort of felt like that. He had to take it when it was presenting. So he always has his eye out for the major chance, and it comes when there is again a royalist uprising in Paris, and which threatens the revolution under the Directory. And they need a general, they need an army man, all right? These 5 directors aren't military people, and they look around for one. They look at Bernadotte, they look at Junot. But for one reason or another, they're not certain, and finally someone recommends the young hero of Toulon. And so he is sent in and at the church of Saint-Roch in the middle of Paris, he turns his cannons, he gets his friend, this is the first time he will work with Murat, right? Murat. And they get cannons and they fire into the crowd, which is quite extraordinary. He calls it a whip of grape shot, and kills about, couple of hundred, if not more, people, but that's the end of the Royalist rebellion. So, and the Directoire are delighted. They've found their strong man, but of course there will be no stopping him. So this is sort of 2 coups that he brings about. The first one is in Vendémiaire, and the next one will be at Brumaire. So this then is, I'm going to speak about Murat later when we're talking about Caroline. He will be married to Napoleon's youngest sister. They are a couple. He basically is dominated by Caroline. She finally becomes of the conclusion that Napoleon was right, that he's extraordinarily courageous and impetuous, but a dolt, someone who really is a fool. In fact, Napoleon thinks he's a fool off the battlefield. He thinks he's useless, and his wife comes to the same conclusion after a number of years. All right, so we'll look at him later. Now, it's at this time that he marries Josephine, changes her name from Rose to Josephine because she's now his property. She has to have a new name, a new start. Gives her a pendant which has to destiny written on the back of it, and tells her to go and buy a house or a small mansion which will be suitable for him to receive the diplomats and the heads of Europe and to work with his generals. So he already has this idea in mind. She, of course, as we know, overspends. As we saw before, he comes back, he's horrified. Not only has she spent all of his generals' pay packet, but he's also borrowed from Joseph. So in other words, he's gone into debt with his siblings. Not a good idea. All right, so we now have Napoleon put at the head of the army of Italy. Why? Because the whole idea of the revolution was to export the revolutionary ideas to the rest of Europe, to get rid of these worm-ridden monarchies, right? Liberty, fraternity, equality, equality. These were the ideas that the French were going to export willy-nilly to the rest of Europe. And in Italy at the time, of course, wasn't Italy. It wasn't constituted as it is now. That was 1860. It was a number of states, and most of them were dominated by the Austrians at the time. So Napoleon is going to try and get rid of the Austrians from Italy. And he goes out just after having been married, leaves his bride after having been bitten on his wedding night by her pet pug, and goes off to pull off a series of brilliant victories, all of which is going to establish the pattern. You know, they're led by Napoleon, but they're always near disasters, and this pattern gets worse and worse until they are a disaster. All right. For example, this one here is when he is trying to, the Austrians on the other side of the bridge, his army won't go across, so he grabs the flag and runs across. And you get the moment, and this is what we're going to talk about next week, is the beginning of the Napoleonic propaganda machine. He now, even though he's only, in his early 20s, he's understood, he says actually a newspaper article and a picture are worth 5,000 bayonets. Right, he's got that figured out. So he has his own pet painters there on the scene, and then he says, I want myself in the centre. He dictates the terms of the painting. And so it is a new type of military painting with, it's me, it's all about me. I mean, where's the army? Nowhere. It's just about this dynamic figure turning, to encourage, looking off into the distance. But he is still very much under the Republican flag with the Republican colours here, the tricolor, and very clear with the sword. All right, so he is literally the sword of the Republic. In actual fact, he fell off the bridge and was nearly drowned in mud. But that is not the moment is not depicted. He then also goes on to the Battle of Rivoli. So we get the Rivoli Theatre, the Rue de Rivoli in Paris, which is another brilliant victory. Here we have the moment that he's chosen, or that Filippo has chosen to depict, is when his horse is killed under him, and he someone just grabs another horse and gets on without really even a glance behind. Now, this established, the Battle of Rivoli establishes many things about his style. The French became known for their quick manoeuvres, their forced marching, their ability to move from one flank to another, the rapidity of their reaction style. They used to have inner ranks which could fill up the others, and in many ways he'd gleaned a lot of these tactics from Tacitus and from the Roman way of fighting. There was something else I was going to say about the Battle of Rivoli, but oh, that's right. Wellington, for example, the Duke of Wellington was someone also an Englishman who had a great deal of time for Napoleon. And later on he would say his presence on the field was worth 40,000 soldiers. And I thought I must have misread it was 4, but no, it's 40,000. Evidently he was all over the place. He was galloping around, encouraging people the night before, going into the fray himself. A very, very dynamic leader. I've always sort of wondered about these harangues, though. He used to get up and harangue the troops. I mean, you've got 40,000 soldiers. Who could hear you? I mean, it's a bit like that Monty Python Sermon on the Mount. Anyway, obviously, people had very good hearing in those days, right? We then also get after those two victories, they set up an ability for him to sign the peace with the Austrians, and that will set up peace with the British. He then actually comes back, and what we have here is the Battle of Marengo, right? Another attack on the Austrians, and this is the third coalition which is grouped against him. In fact, it was the coalition now, the French, who are still the Republican army, are fighting the might of the Holy Roman Emperor, Francis the Holy Roman Emperor, and Alexander of Russia, all right? And it's called the Battle of the Three Empires. Now, what we have here is, again, a glorified image of what happened at the Battle of Marengo. It was in winter. Napoleon realises that the Austrians also have got their forces over bringing them round to Genoa, and he realises he's not going to have time to go around the normal way. So he goes across the Alps when the St Bernard Pass wasn't even open. He takes his army across. Now, of course, you can see vaguely a bit of the army in the background here. It's, again, all about me. He goes across. I won't go into the different manoeuvres, but it's one of his brilliant victories, all right? So there are two big victories that you always talk about with Napoleon. One is Marengo, and the other is Austerlitz, right? Now, Marengo, he routs the coalition and then sets up for this peace. It's at Marengo that all of the great generals are going to distinguish themselves, in particular Kellermann. Now, there were two great cavalry generals. You've got Murat and Kellermann. Kellermann was a heavy cavalry man with a different type of horse, and Murat is the sort of the cavalry that sort of wings around and manoeuvres on the lighter horses. Now, in actual fact, Napoleon was retreating at different ways. It wasn't a clear victory at all. It wasn't the way in which his propaganda comes out, and in fact, he was saved completely by one of the cavalry charges of Kellermann. Kellermann's not mentioned, right? We never hear about him. It's all me having, at the head of my brigade, having finally retreated tactically and then come in and saved the day. So you've got his machine working cleverly, and then of course the image that even, what's the image that we've got now for the NGV? It's Napoleon on his horse, winning the Battle of Marengo. I mean, propaganda is everything, the truth is nothing. And he actually realised that very, very clearly. So I want to look at this later, but you'll notice that he puts himself here. You have Hannibal, of course, the other person who went over the Alps to win, all right? And then you've got Bonaparte. This is actually how he went over the Alps, on a mule, because, I mean, no one could go over on a charger like that. All right. This, of course, was painted under the time of the restoration of the Bourbon kings. So they're side by side in the Louvre. It's quite amusing. All right, well, he comes back, and again, is still, he's got really as far in many ways as he can go. He's not a member of the Directory. He's still their right-hand sword, but, and the Directory are a bit worried about him. He's got a lot of power. He's got the army behind him. What are we going to do with this man? He's sort of, itching for the next move. He thinks of invading England. In fact, he even has a set of coins set up with him in London. And he actually says, paper and paint and bricks disappear, but metal stays forever. So the propaganda idea was there. Anyway, he finally persuades the Directory to allow him to go, and if you can't get the British by going across the ditch, as the French call it, we'll get them in another way and cut off their trade routes from India if you can possibly get hold of Egypt and all of that. And his idea was to get to Egypt, and somehow, my geography isn't very good, but to get down and actually cut off, he's going to take over India. That was another part of his desire. So this is again a great expedition. He goes out with ship very, very different from the normal kind of naval attack, particularly the British naval sort of expeditions. He takes a boat full of learned people. He takes the greatest physicians, mathematicians, botanists, historians, artists, shipfuls of books and so on. And out of this you will find, even though the French lose, and in fact he has to get out and they lose everything to the British, you get the first publications on Egypt, and it will establish the discipline of Egyptology and archaeology in general. And the person who goes with him, Dunant, will be the founder of the Louvre. So this is again him, one of his famous sayings at the time was, soldiers, he's haranguing the troops in the desert. I mean, I can't imagine anything worse. Soldiers, from above these pyramids, 40,000 centuries contemplate you, and so on. This is, it's a bit of a disaster. The British actually scuttle the fleet at Abu Qir. The French are more or less cut off, stuck in Egypt, and so he makes the best of it by going on to attack Jaffa and lays siege to Acre. So he takes over Cairo, all of these parts, briefly decides he's a Muslim, then decides he's not. And then we have this great sort of problem with the plague breaking out amongst the army, and he goes in amongst the plague victims to show that you have to have courage, that he is not afraid, that it really is a psychological sort of condition. And we'll talk about this later in relation to his ideas of the medical profession. But here he's clearly standing out almost as this Christ-like figure, relating himself to the kings of France who were thought to have had a cure, be able to cure people by touching them. So all of this painting isn't just sort of picturesque images of me in Egypt. It's already planting the image that he will be able to set up a dynasty as the dynasties of Charlemagne, down from the ages, and he will have these kind of powers, very Christ-like gesture. But we'll talk about that painting in much more detail next week. While he's over there, first of all, he finds out two things. This is going a bit longer than I thought, but anyway, he finds out that, first of all, Josephine has been, having it off with publicly, virtually, with Hippolyte Charles. But secondly, it is time, if he wants to actually take over the reins of power, that there's discontent with the Directory, that now he could come. So in the night, he actually gets a ship, leaves a written orders to his second in command, and skedaddles to France. To cut a very long story short, he arrives, is greeted as a hero, and immediately starts plotting with two of those 5 directors to bring the others down and establish a consulship of 3 people. So this is what happens. He works with Bernadotte. The others, Bernadotte won't commit himself. Josephine's very useful for networking for him. And he manages to convince the Council of 500, who are the governing body, that there's a royalist plot and that they're going to be assassinated, and they must place themselves under his protection at Saint-Cloud. They do. They get out there, then they suddenly realise they're surrounded by the French army, and he gets up in the tribune to speak, and he is mobbed. And remember, we spoke about this in relation to Lucien. He's actually really surrounded by this threatening group of senators. It's Lucien who gets up and wins the day by his extraordinary oratory and leaves enough time for one of his subordinates to go out and warn Murat, who's outside, that it's time to come in with the beating of the drums and tell them that, you know, the Directoire is over. So he is saved very much by his brother and by Murat. And when he finally is sworn in as one of the consuls, the others are Ducat and Sayes, they are surprised when they find that, in fact, he has taken over already as first consul and immediately moves into Tuileries. And Lucien and Murat, it festers with them through the rest of their career that they were not recognised for the role that they played in this key turning point from the one regime to another, the real springboard for Napoleon to become emperor. He takes over then very amply, very effectively as an administrator now, as well as being the great general, and of course changes his image, right? He has to show he's not just good on horseback, but he's good, you know, here with documents. He's pointing here to the, if you've got good eyesight, you can see he's pointing to the different battles, Arcola that we saw, Rivoli, Marengo, and so on. In 1804, by plebiscite, a so-called plebiscite, he crowns himself Emperor of France. And we have the moment when he crowns Josephine, and it's after this point, after 1804, that he is going to set his siblings up on these different thrones and dukes and duchies of Europe. Now, he disseminates this image throughout France, right? He gets the best artists that exist at the time. You've got David, Ingres, Triosson, Isabey, Gérard, Lefebvre, and others, all of who are the great panoply of 19th century artists, worked night and day doing multiple copies of him in his robes. He's changed from that very sort of endearing romantic hero at Arcola to the very cold, expressionless figure of power. And all through the France, he's now reorganised France into départements, each would have a number, each has a mayor, and each of these mairies has a photo, at least a painting of him. Now, we're moving towards the high point, I suppose, of his reign. He's now emperor, and we now go to the Battle of Austerlitz, which again is against the Austrians. And this is one of the great turning points, I suppose, in the Napoleonic epoch, well, you know, what do you call it, epopee, heroic legend, is the tactics that he uses here. He's outnumbered by the Austrians and uses tactics which are most unusual. He works with the land, the rise and fall of the land, and with the weather conditions. And to not go into it too long, what he does is he manages to make out that he is retreating. And the night before at the bivouac, which is actually on the day of his coronation, so he thinks again, destiny. All right. The soldiers all light little candles, and the Austrians think that they're preparing to retreat because they've seen that they're outnumbered. In actual fact, he withdraws his army. In fact, he even abandons a position on the high point. And so the Austrians think, well, you know, we must have got it done. He's even abandoning his advantage. What in actual fact he'd done was that he realised that there was a very, very heavy mist which would last from dawn right through to about mid-morning. And so he has his troops massed below at this point where the mist is heaviest. And so when the sound of the attack is sounded, the Austrians can't see him advancing. And by the time that they can actually, the dawn comes up and the great sun of Austerlitz, you know, this is the moment it's actually spoken about in French literature, the sun which comes up, the Austrians suddenly see, and they are totally surrounded by the French. All right, so it's one of these great tactical victories that could have been an absolute disaster if the sun had come out like 3 hours earlier. But this is typical of Napoleon. But he did it so well that it is thought that possibly he began to believe in his own invincibility from that point onwards, and committed many sort of errors in his strategies and so on. But again, he's always helped by these brilliant generals whom he manages to pull to him and who usually would die for him, are very loyal. This is again, it's one of these days. It's a bit like, the Battle of Agincourt, crisp and crispien shall ne'er go by, another one of these harangues that, one wonders if you can hear if you've got a helmet over your ears. But anyway, soldats, lorsque tout c'est nécessaire pour assurer le bonheur, and so soldiers, when everything that's essential to show to assure the happiness and the prosperity of our country, our homeland will have been taken care of, I will take you back to France, and there you'll be the object of my great my tender solicitude, my unending care. My people, you will notice, my people, when they see you with joy, it'll be enough for you to say, I was at Austerlitz, and they will reply, there is a courageous man, all right? Very similar to the same as it must have been set speeches one had to learn when one was a general. I should be haranguing you. You can do it. You can get through another hour and a half. All right. Now things actually, as I said, he did begin to believe in his ability to pull things off out of extraordinary circumstances, and we have one of the great almost disasters. And as his disasters become closer to being disasters, his victories get closer to being disasters, his propaganda work steps up. And so there's a real sort of correlation between the lack of reality of what happens in these paintings and reality. And I'll speak about this again next week, but it's again, it's a battle which takes place in one day between the Prussians and the French. I think the French lose 20,000 and the Prussians lose 30,000. This is in a day. And the number of wounded, he stays there. No, it was a technical victory. It is fought in minus 15 degrees in the snow, and it is won by the great charge, again, these cavalry charges of Murat. When the day dawns, it's won by the French because they happen to be on the battlefield, and so they are technically the winners. Both sides are too exhausted and depleted to continue. It's this time that you get huge numbers of medical inventions, which we'll talk about. But he actually, of course, doesn't want this painted, so he sets up a competition for the painters, and this is the winning one, which will be shown at the Louvre because he needs propaganda. And this is him, like Christ again, looking, he's above all of this wounded, looking to heavens what has happened. And of course we have Murat there, who symbolises the swashbuckling power, whereas you get the the weary statesman-like God, almost Christ-like figure of Napoleon. Well, he has found out that he can actually, by this stage, have children, as we'll see when we talk about Caroline, and divorces Josephine, is inconsolable probably for about 10 months, I suppose, all these letters, I tenderly, feel that, shall never love again, a bit like Paul McCartney, and, we won't go into it, ladies, will we? But anyway, he then marries the young Marie-Louise, who gives him the heir. Now, in 1811, I just want to show at the more or less the height of the Napoleonic Empire, this was considered France. These were parts of France which were under, at least Europe, which were under French dominion, and these were parts which were more or less allied. So you've really basically got all of these parts here. Portugal, of course, allied to Great Britain. The logic now of this regime is that he has to keep fighting. You can't suddenly say, well, that's it. I'm retiring. I'm going to sue for peace. By now, he has all of Europe against him, waiting for a sign of weakness. He gathers together the greatest army that had ever existed, and decides he's going to go and finally conquer Russia. As you know, the Russians can't fight him, so they withdraw and withdraw and withdraw, and he allows himself to be drawn into this freezing winter. The Russians burn the towns, burn Moscow. There's nothing for them to eat. To cut a very long story short, he retreats himself and comes back to Paris, leaving the army, which is a tiny proportion. You know, they starved to death. They ate the horses. They, awful stuff. And he's left under the command of Murat, who also takes fright and runs off. And of course, the person who has to take over is Eugène. He abdicates in 1814 and is sent to the island of Elba. This is the British here, of course, cartoonists love this. He only stays there for a very short time, as you can see. It's thought that the British actually connived in his own escape because the Allies had put the Bourbons back on the throne of France. It wasn't successful. It does seem very odd that the person who was supposed to be making sure that Napoleon was there wasn't there at the time. He was allowed to have a small court. He had courtiers. His mother and Pauline were there. He arrives in the south of France at Antibes with a couple of hundred people, really, and the Bourbons sent down the army to stop him. And he stands in the middle of the road and says, "I am your emperor, you know, shoot if you wish." And literally the whole army sort of turn and follow him. And so he walks up, he proceeds up to Paris and takes over. The Bourbons fly out, and you will see in the exhibition wonderful images of this, because when the Bourbons came to power after the first abdication, they melted down all of the eagles that he had, these wonderful eagles, and of course they put up fleur-de-lis, and after 100 days he's back again, and then he gets rid of the fleur-de-lis and he has to make new eagles. And so in the exhibition you've actually got these rather rough cast eagles. They didn't have time to do them properly, so it's really very interesting. So then of course we have the Battle of Waterloo, which is with the entire coalition of Europe against him, and even then it's, you know, it could have gone both ways. Part of his army arrives too late, and of course he is betrayed also. He has been betrayed by his sister, who has allowed the British into the port of Naples. So he then abdicates again and goes to St Helena and dies in St Helena in 1821. But what's important for us about St Helena is that when he is there, he writes his memoirs, all right, which will change. He thinks about what he should have done. He reinterprets his life, and this is the testimonial with these wonderful propaganda paintings that we have, and they're very, very effective in moulding the way in which we see Napoleon. More moulding opinion in the rest of the world. Us as an English colony, of course, slavishly have followed the idea of Napoleon as the boogeyman, the short little fellow, the ogre of Europe, and so on. So this is a painting of him rising to glory after death on St Helena. His shackles have been broken, the eagle is dead, but he is rising from the shroud with a wreath of victory on his head. Getting back to the testimonial of St Helena, he writes, there's 4 versions of it. The most important one was written by Lascars, called the Memorial of St Helena. It's a good read. In it he says, "My sister Elisa has a masculine mind, a forceful character, noble qualities and outstanding intelligence. She will endure adversity with fortitude. Caroline has been formed by events. As a child we considered her the dunce and the Cinderella of the family, but she developed into a very pretty woman and schooled herself to be a clever one. There's good stuff in her, vitiated by vaulting ambition. Pauline was always probably the most beautiful woman of her time and will, to her end, be the best creature in the world." Well, as you can see, he shows a decided preference for Pauline in those people. Now, I want to move to a moment in history, which is after the battle of in the campaign of that early campaign of Arcola and Rivoli. He's won over Italy from the Austrians, and he calls his family together at the Villa Crevelli in Mombello to speak to them. He likes having his family around, and it's a moment which is quite fraught, because it's the first time you're going to get all of the Napoleonic women together. And there are several problems with this. First of all, Josephine will meet Madame Mother for the first time. Madame Mother is not amused. Napoleon hasn't asked her permission or her advice before he went off and married this profligate older woman with a couple of kids, a big spender and known to be an adulteress. So that is going to be a fairly tense moment. So you've got that which is going to work, all right? It doesn't work at all, and as we know, the battle lines between the Beauharnais and the Bonapartes will be basically established at this meeting. Josephine, being so elegant, makes the Bonaparte women feel like provincial, so nobodies, and this is where the jealousy starts. You also have the problem of his eldest sister. Now, she had come over, as we'll see, she studied in France, but she wasn't particularly attractive. She wasn't married by the time she was in her early 20s. People were panicking. And so, without having asked, again, Napoleon's permission or what he thought, Napoleon's mother and Lucien, remember it's always Lucien who's going to be a sort of fly in the ointment, encourage her to accept the hand of a sort of a Corsican nobody, Felix Bacchiocchi. So they're anxious about how Napoleon is going to view this marriage. Now, he's now rising, all right? He's now at the stage where he wants to get an important network around him, and he doesn't want this nobody from Corsica. I mean, this is a waste of a position in the Bonaparte family. It's also a time he's going to get his younger sister out of school and bring her up to Montbello. This is Caroline, who is one of the great beauties, not as beautiful as Pauline, impressionable, blonde, by the way. You can't see it here, but the Bonapartes weren't dark. Right? They were quite fair-skinned, and she meets Murat for the first time. She's only about 15, falls madly in love with Murat, who's very taken with her as well, a swashbuckling sort of character. Bonaparte is totally against this marriage to begin with. He thinks this man is a sensualist and a womanizer and a fool, and he doesn't want his younger sister being married to her. And he sort of says things to Caroline such as, "Can you imagine, standing there, you, madam, in your flimsy chemise, and this swashbuckling womanizer comes into the room fresh from the cavalry," and she sort of saying, "Yes, that's a good, yes." He really gets it wrong. And Napoleon's a bit of a prude, actually. He does not approve at all of the womanizing activities of most of his officers. All right, so eventually they will, of course, get married, but this is where they meet, and the other one is where he's going to marry off. He's looking around for a suitor for his most beautiful sister, who is proving to be a man-eater, and he actually wants to get her respectably married off. So he's got a few problems on his hands, and this is sort of what the British make of it. Poor Napoleon with I don't know if this is Josephine or gorging themselves, and here's the ghastly sisters, with patch and paint, half naked, and the writings on the wall, many, many tickle of Salem. All right, well, let's quickly get on to Elisa, who becomes the Grand Duchess of Lucca, Princess of Piombo, and Queen of Etruria. They all these extraordinary titles. Now, don't forget that they're Italians, and so these three sisters are going to die in Italy, spend most of their exile in Italy, and be most comfortable there. Now, she's married to Bacchiocchi, who actually is perfectly prepared to live in her shadow, right? He's promoted through the ranks by his brother-in-law, who thinks he's an absolute dolt, but so long as he just is there as a kind of handbag for Elisa. Now, she had spent something like 7 years in the Saint-Cyr Academy for Young Girls at the time when Napoleon was studying and Joseph was studying in France. So she was brought up in the old ancien régime of the salon, the literature, this idea of transmission of literature and ideas where these great women hold salons. You know what this is, don't you? And so when she her brother comes to power at the time of the coup d'etat, and particularly when he's emperor, she gathers around her all the great writers of the time, and particularly some of the old people from the old aristocracy, who she gets taken off the émigré list, and so provides him with a kind of network through the old aristocracy, which is what he was searching to do when he married Josephine. So she gives this kind of, intellectual, arty kind of flavour to what could have been just sort of seen as a bloody sort of bloodbath on the battlefields of Europe. And she she's very fond of her brother Lucien. She doesn't particularly like Napoleon. She also thinks that he's a bit of a megalomaniac, but she adores Lucien, lives in Lucien's house when his wife's away, acts as hostess. She also will be the person who introduces Chateaubriand, the great French writer, to Napoleon, gets Napoleon to read his work, and it's through this link that Napoleon will send him to be the ambassador to Rome, and they will establish links with the Pope, who will re-establish Catholicism. So this networking through his elder sister is important. There we have Lucien as well. Now, at the time of the coronation, as we spoke about last week, of course, she is one of the sisters who's furious about having to play second fiddle to Josephine, and is delighted when, after the coronation, she is promoted. She's the first of them to be promoted to her own area, her own, not exactly crown, but she becomes Duchess. She's invited to officiate next to Napoleon when he is the King of Italy. Josephine didn't want to come, she was too busy with other people. So she produces a whole series of images of herself, which we will look at when we're looking at propaganda painting. But her first role is Duchess of Lucca in the north of Italy, in the north of Tuscany. Now, this means that with her, she will actually be given all of this land here, Tuscany, right down to the bottom here and up here. Now, this is Bagni di Lucca. I don't know whether any of you know it. In Gafagnana, it's a beautiful little town. She establishes the first casino in the world, evidently, is established there by Elisa Bonaparte. Now, she does exactly what she has been told to do. Now, she works as a kind of joint sovereign. She sees herself as, on a par with Napoleon to some degree. And this is one of the real problems with his siblings, is that they all felt that they ruled as in their own right. They lost sight of the fact that they basically had their position simply because their brother had put them there. And they actually took themselves seriously as, dukes and duchesses and kings, and works with their subjects. And began to look after their own subjects' interests rather than their brother's interests, which infuriates Napoleon. He keeps having to say, "Madam, you're there because I put you there." So, but she does all the sorts of things that Napoleon would have done. She sets up a university, she sets up 2 libraries. And by the way, his brother Louis, he's the first person who starts in Amsterdam, the great museum. What's it called? Right, yes. That's the established thing by the Bonapartes. They always set up a museum. They set up universities. They set up a chair of medicine. She sets up a school for girls. She goes in, builds bridges. She gets rid of pirates. She looks after the sort of luxury industry. She's everywhere, like her brother, morning, noon and night, doing it all herself. But also, particularly, Lucca becomes known as one of the cultured courts of Italy. And here you have her sitting up there. There's her brother, her husband, with a likeness of her by Canova, the great Italian sculptor. And of course, Canova is here. Paganini played at her court. Do you know what I mean? So she encourages the arts. Now, she is given, finally, part of Italy, which includes Carrera. And so she produces multiple busts of her brother, and here is one of her mother, and she will be responsible for giving the marble to her sister, Pauline. This is this ghastly statue that was commissioned by Napoleon of himself as a warrior, which is basically based on one of the warriors in the Louvre. And when Canova produces it, he didn't mean it to be quite like that. So this is Napoleon. He hated it so much he put it in a cupboard. And then, of course, it's taken by the British and has ended up in Apsley House, the property of the Duke of Wellington. I mean, it's true, as Napoleon said, from the sublime to the ridiculous, there's only one step. So here we have portraits of her with her daughter. She, great patroness of the arts. This is another thing that all of these people were supposed to do, was to promote the luxury arts in France. Now, when things start to get difficult in 1814, she does not think of betraying Napoleon. She thinks of herself as being ruler. What does a ruler do? Sends an army down to fight in Italy, contacts Murat, who's by now King of Naples, and sort of says, look, you need to help me here. I've only got a very small army. She doesn't realise that Murat has already decided to defect to the Allies and in fact already has in his mind to take over all of Italy. So she, when the Allies in 1814 finally advance through the north of Italy, all her lands are taken, she flees as a refugee from one point to another, and will end up finally in Trieste, in house arrest for a long time, and she's quite pleased about this because she thinks, God, I'm so important, they put me under house arrest, you know. But also wants to deal with the Austrians to get her property back. Shrewd businesswoman, you know, and finally does get much of her property back, much to the horror of her other sister, Pauline, who said, you're not thinking about her brother. What are you doing about our brother who's on Elba? What are you doing about him when he's in St. Helena? Don't care is the answer. I'm not going to Elba. I'm looking after my own interests. All right? So someone who, while she was in power and had the backing of her brother, was effective, but not afterwards. We now come to Pauline, who was considered the great beauty of Europe. Now, here we have a breast cup, which is made from, you know, by Audio. It wasn't just, you know, on her breast. It was a kind of popular thing that you had. Now, she, of course, is one of these unschooled members of the Napoleonic family. Remember that his mother has to leave Corsica with the three youngest, Jerome, Pauline, and Caroline, who don't really have any education. And so she arrives in Marseille, living in very poor circumstances, and is courted by Ferrand. Ferrand is was close to Robespierre. He was someone important during the Reign of Terror, but because he was in the south of France, had managed to escape. You know, when Robespierre comes unstuck, the people around him did too. He managed to escape because he's not there. And actually turns his coat and works with the people in the directorship, but blocks Napoleon at that siege of Toulon. Remember, Napoleon was trying to take over. He's blocked by Ferrand, and Napoleon's not about to forget that. Well, Ferrand's 20 years older than Pauline, starts a flirtation with her, and then absolutely falls for her, and they have this passionate affair, these extraordinary misspelt letters by Pauline, who really doesn't ever master French particularly well. And it looks for a while as though she's going to elope or try and marry him, and Napoleon and Josephine step in and stop anything like this, and she will never forgive Josephine for her part in stopping her marriage. And it's quite, the reason I'm mentioning it is that she, for the rest of her life, goes from one man to another, almost sort of in search of this sort of one person that she could have had. It was really sort of one of these almost romantic stories. And she is not interested in power in her own right. She just wants to be the Queen of Hearts, right? She just is very narcissistic. She spends her life sort of sitting, you know, on couches in these extraordinary outfits, literally with her feet on people. She even uses members of the English aristocracy as her footstool. Or she had, her ladies-in-waiting used to be her footstool. She used to receive her gentleman friend in the bath, you know, while she's rouging her nipples, you know, or would have herself carried by her big black slaves from one bath to the next, you know, little bit of the old provocateur there. But anyway, that's how she will spend her life. Now, Napoleon, first of all, thinks of marrying her off. He's got to get her away from Ferrand and people like that, and he wants to make an alliance with his generals. He thinks of Marmont, who will be one of the great generals in his army. And Marmont says, look, no thanks. You know, she's beautiful, but trouble. All right? And Marmont's a shrewd cookie. He is one important in the Battle of Wagram, Austerlitz. But finally, when it comes to defending Paris against the Allies for Napoleon, he puts up a very pathetic defence and actually gives in to the Allies. So he turns his coat in many ways. Maybe it wasn't so much that, it was the fact that he realised he just didn't want Paris to be sacked by the Allies. But anyhow, the Bourbons don't ever trust him, and they say, you'll betray us the way you betrayed him. And Napoleon, when he's on St. Helena, he said, would it have been different if I'd allowed him, you know, if he had married Pauline? Then he thinks of this Junot, Andoche, the Duc d'Abrantes. Now, he's quite an important person in the saga. He's mad about Pauline. They would love to marry her, but he's a bit like Murat. Napoleon thinks he's great on the battlefield, but, you know, you wouldn't want to trust him too much with anything else. Eventually he will have an affair with Caroline. Caroline will use him because he becomes governor of Paris, and she will manipulate him. All right, now Pauline has all these men, but she does it sort of out of a kind of romantic sense. It's not to manipulate them in any way to get further power. Anyway, he's married. Napoleon marries her off to one of his favourite generals, who is the General Leclerc, who looks like Napoleon, who is called the Blonde Napoleon. He walks like Napoleon, does everything the right way. And though he adores his wife, he finds that she's extremely expensive. All these women were, and asks for different, postings to be able to get more money. Murat's making a fortune in Spain. Why can't I do that? So he's sent off to Portugal. Doesn't seem to be able to do it. So in the end, I'll talk about that in a moment. Napoleon decides to send him off to what is now Haiti. Is that how you pronounce it? Haiti? What is Haiti? When it's in French, it's Haiti, which at the time was called Saint Domingue. And why? Because there has been a slave uprising there. And of course, slavery was abolished during the Revolution. And there is a slave army who has at its head Toussaint Louverture, who is now fighting the French colonies, the colonialists there. So Leclerc is sent out with Pauline, who doesn't want to go. She's the fashion queen of Paris, and going to be sent out to this island. In the end, she's said, you are a Bonaparte. You have to do your duty. And, she always rises when she had to this idea. All of these women were extremely courageous and strong-willed, very, very different from, I suppose, the run-of-the-mill French woman at the time. Anyhow, to cut a very long story short, Leclerc is not given enough provisions, enough army, and he loses a number of men fighting the slaves or the ex-slaves, finally manages to capture or have a truce with him and sends him off to Paris, where he is betrayed and dies of pneumonia. Now this causes furor, again, renewed furor in Saint Domingue, with the fact that Napoleon re-establishes slavery in Guadeloupe. Right, that's not one of Napoleon's glorious moments. And this news comes in, and there is a massive uprising, and which Leclerc struggles to maintain. And at the same time, there is a massive wave of yellow fever. People die, and in fact, Leclerc dies over there. So the French will lose the colony, by the way. So Pauline comes back, a widow, having the dramatic gesture of cutting off her long black hair and putting it in the casket and so on. In the meantime, before she left, she'd actually had a son given the strange name of Dermid, which I'll mention next week. And she never seems to have actually recovered from this birth, whether she had some kind of got infection in the fallopian tubes or something, I'm not sure. But she's always going off to take the waters. This was the only way in which people seem to be able to be cured of these sorts of inflammations. And there always seems to be some kind of gynecological problem with her, which is one of the reasons why she's always reclining on a couch, and she has to be sort of carried around, and she has to have special things. But it doesn't seem to have stopped her, fiddling around, so to speak. Napoleon then she falls for a swashbuckling prince who happens to be in Paris, who is one of the Borghese prince, the Italian. And for a while she's really keen on him. It turns out that he's probably either bisexual or homosexual, but it works for a while, and she's encouraged by Napoleon to marry, even though she's not out of her widowhood, because she now is a princess in her own right. She's no longer not like her siblings who are princes and queens because Napoleon has created them. She is a princess because of her marriage. Now they are fabulously wealthy, the Borghese, so she immediately is given the use of and owns half of the Borghese diamonds. So we have this beautiful woman in the Villa Borghese, as you know, the Borghese Gardens, the Borghese Museum, and as a present to her husband, she has herself sculpted by Canova as Venus, naked. Now, of course, Napoleon's appalled. Here he is trying to sort of put this, moral, state across Europe, and here's his sister sitting up naked, and people were invited to come and see it. And someone sort of said to her, well, wasn't it difficult? And she said, oh, no, the room was warm, you know. So completely missing the point. So someone who is in love with her own beauty. Now, she takes a number of lovers. Now, most of them were forced to marry these clanking generals, but she was interested in people who were in the arts, and so she has a long affair with Forbin. The one here, he's a musician. The one here who's most important is Talma, who was the great dramatic actor in Paris at the time, responsible for bringing Shakespeare in translation to Paris, the great actor who was beloved of Napoleon. And he was mad about her, you know, writes her these declamatory letters, but, you know, 3 months on and she's forgotten him. Now, I just want to give you, these are some of the lovers, some of. And the husbands aren't mentioned in there either. So, you know, she really was a busy woman. Yes, she was. Now, she was, however, devoted to Napoleon. And at the time, between the time of Napoleon's divorce and his remarriage, which wasn't very long, as we saw, she actually leaves one of the lovers. She actually moves with them around France, comes back up to Paris and holds court for her brother. And she's given the Hôtel de Charceau, which was eventually sold to Wellington. And by the way, Wellington was not insensible to the charms of Pauline either. So this is all this quite interesting sort of things that go on. So it's at this time that you get the British really going into hype over the fact that there's an incestuous relationship between them. She's called the Messalina of Paris and so on. There's not the scrap of evidence, a scrap, and I mean a scrap. Someone somewhere thought that they might have seen or known someone who thought they'd read a letter. And what I found most annoying is that there's this woman, the daughter of Antonia Fraser, Flora Fraser, who's written a book called Venus of Empire, which has just been published, who spends a lot of time, 3 pages, recounting all of these things and says, oh, but of course there's no evidence. Do you know what I mean? So the British sort of still keep it going. Anyway, of course it's ridiculous. Now, at the time when her brother finally gets into difficulties, this is when she shows her true form, courageously, immediately gives her diamonds, gives half the Borghese wealth, which the Borghese weren't all happy about, to her brother because she thinks he's going to need money, and says, I will come to Elba with you. But she's also, at this time, of course, her sister and Murat have already defected to the Allies. And Napoleon, even though he's going into exile, has decided to not cut them off because he's got the idea that he'll make a comeback. And so he uses Pauline, because the British, no one suspects Pauline of being able to formulate 2 thoughts, all right? They're all worried that their generals and their diplomats are going to be seduced by her. That's the real worry. So she actually can travel where the other members of the family can't. And so Napoleon sends her down to Naples, where she negotiates with her sister and Murat, and indeed is successful, because Murat will turn back to be on Napoleon's side during those 100 days between when he leaves Elba and Waterloo. Murat is theoretically there, all right, even though it doesn't work, but that's through the diplomacy of Pauline, who then goes and stays on Elba with him and animates all his evenings, because he likes pretty girls, and she works having lovely sort of candlelit dinners and so on, and his mother. So these are the 2 ones who stick by him. When, of course, the 100 days, she has to leave when it's over, goes into exile in Italy, wanders around, and dies of stomach cancer. You actually have the father of Napoleon who dies of stomach cancer, Lucien, Napoleon, Caroline, and Pauline, which is a lot, isn't it? 4 out of the 8. I don't actually know what the others died of. Elisa dies of a kind of a fever she caught during the archaeological digs. You die the way you live, don't you? Anyway, so Pauline is actually buried in the Borghese Chapel in Santa Maria Maggiore in Rome. And as you know, the Borghese Chapel has the great Borghese popes you know, the ones who were sort of the patrons of Bernini, Borromini, and so on. So you've got the popes on either side, and then there's Pauline. It's really quite sort of, you know, comic opera stuff. Well, we now get then to the third one, Caroline, who was a woman who was hungry for power, extraordinary ambition, and was the greatest manipulator of the three, all right? Elisa did what she was told. She was a good sort of ruler, but didn't really support him. Pauline was a bit of a worry on the moral front, but was there when she was needed, whereas Caroline combines all of these things. She's a seductress, she's very good looking, but she has her eye on the top job, would you believe? Now, let's have a quick look at her. She also had no education, but by the time we get down to her, Napoleon's decided he's going to send her off to this academy, remember, by Madame Campan outside Paris. She had worked at the court of Marie Antoinette, and to give her a veneer of respectability. She's not the slightest bit interested in learning anything. She's already met Murat. All she wants to do is sort of jump out the window and run off to Murat. So finally, what happens is, at the time, the coup d'etat of Brumaire, remember, where he's, you know, takes over power, Lucien steps in and he becomes consul. There's a knocking on Caroline's door, and it says, you know, Paris has given in to Murat and Bonaparte. And this is the way she's going to see it for the rest of her life. She actually thinks that her husband, Murat, who will become her husband, would be able at any point to take over. And because she really eventually doesn't have much respect for his ability to take over, it means that she would take over, all right? And she will manoeuvre throughout her reign to get into a position that either her children will become the heirs or that she will take over. So this is this swashbuckling Murat, as we saw last week, sort of, you know, rather keen on himself, but I mean, you know, he's, you know, well, yeah, anyway, he's there. He's in every painting at the Battle of Eylau. We'll talk about him again. We saw him last week in his finest outfit there on a horse, also, who spent hours doing its eyelashes by the look of things. Again, here. Now, what happens with Murat is that finally, first of all, Elisa is given the duchy. Then you get Louis being put on the throne of Holland. Joseph's put on the throne, first of all, of Naples. And Murat's really a bit annoyed. He's taken part in the uprising in Spain. He's been the shock troops at Bagram, at Marengo. He's been to Egypt with Napoleon. He feels he's not getting his due. And it's always Caroline who comes up and negotiates for him, you know, because she's alarmed at the way in which he handles Napoleon. She says, stay on the battlefield and leave it to me. And she does. She gets exactly what she wants out of her brother. She manipulates him extraordinarily. And first of all, they get the Duke, she becomes Duke and Duchess of Cleves. Well, that's not enough. They don't like it. You know, the others have kings. Why don't I? So finally, when Joseph is shunted off from Naples to Spain, that comes free, and they are set up as the King and Queen of Naples, and they take it extremely seriously. Now, during the time before they actually are sent off as King and Queen, they have beautiful mansions built in Paris. The Élysée Palace, for example, was theirs. And it's here that Caroline will stage the most amazing balls with quadrilles, which are all orchestrated to flatter her brother. He likes chess, so she'll do the quadrille, you know, with like chess pieces between Italy and France. Anything that she wants. She knows exactly how to work Napoleon. She knows how to work his vanity, how to work his insecurities. Don't forget, she's the one who's going to introduce the mistresses into the household so that he can find out that he can have a child of his own. Now, it's at this time that she gets a bit worried. She sees that, of course, he is favouring the Beauharnais, that he's adopted Eugène de Beauharnais, and he's actually said that he, if he dies, the people who would take over would be his brother Louis or Joseph, but not the others. All right, and she doesn't like that, you know. And he says, but you know, the French law is like that. The Salic law says that you can't have a royal line going through a woman. She's not happy about that at all. She thinks that the other major player, the other great sword of the empire is, of course, her husband Murat, right? And so should Napoleon be killed on the battlefield, she wants Murat to be ready to take over the vacuum. Now, she knows Murat is no good diplomatically or in any other way. In fact, he writes letters to Napoleon saying, look, I don't agree with what you're doing, you know, all of these sorts of things. That's wrong, you know. And so she has to make up for these things. And so by now, this person who was been in love with her sister, remember, the Duc d'Abrant, is governor of Paris. So Caroline realises you would need the governor of Paris if you're going to seize power in Paris. He has to already be on your side should Napoleon die and Murat is to take power. So she goes out and seduces him, all right? Has no trouble at all. And unfortunately for her is that he's already married to a woman who is a great writer of her memoirs, and she's scribble. And you have these wonderful things. They come back from Malmaison one evening, and Junot takes Caroline in, knocks on the door so she can get in the door, and stays for 3 hours while his wife's sitting scribble in the carriage. And of course, whose memoirs do we read? Well, it's Lord Duc d'Abrant. So all of this has come down. But this is one of the ways in which she manipulates men. Now you see, Pauline didn't do that. She was doing it for her own interests. She also very quickly produces a breed of children. The eldest is Achilles, and she constantly says to Napoleon, you know, your Achilles sends you his wishes. You know, even though Napoleon has said he won't have her, you know, children of his sister as heirs to his throne, she constantly pushes this child towards him. Eventually, these children will actually go over to, at the fall of the Napoleonic Empire, they actually emigrate to America, and the line of the Murats are in America today. Now, these are pictures of Napoleon, we know, with his nieces and nephews. Everyone's desperate to have the nieces and nephews on the royal knee. She was considered to be rather an arriviste in many ways. Remember the great portraitist Vigée Lebrun, who had done the portraits of Marie Antoinette and all the real royalty of Europe, was asked to do the painting of Caroline, and evidently she used to come, she'd fidget, she'd change her hairdo, she'd change her crown, she'd change her clothes. Poor old Vigée Lebrun's next day has to sort of rub it out and start again. She's always late, she was rude. Vigée Lebrun disliked her intensely and said she was sort of arrogant as well, and so that you get a rather bovine image produced by her. But always in the background you have reference to the fact that she's Queen of Naples. Now Joachim there, sort of in his outfit. In the meantime, again, the scheming has been going on. There's problems between the Murat couple. Caroline thinks that Murat makes mistakes. Murat sees himself simply as now King of Naples, is less interested in his affiliation with Napoleon, even though Napoleon is still using him for the cavalry in his fighting. And so while Murat is off fighting the wars, Caroline takes over as regent, and this is what she wanted. After all, her sister is doing what she wants, Elisa up in Tuscany. Why can't she in the south rule like a true Bonaparte? So she overturns many of the things that Murat has put in place, puts other things in place, very sensible things, very Bonaparte-ish type things, you know, setting up institutes and cultural things as well. Murat comes back absolutely furious, relegates her back to the nursery and takes over the reins again. So there's this real sort of power struggle between the two of them. And Caroline decides that she's going to need better backing. And so she deliberately starts an affair with the Austrian diplomat Metternich, who is a very, very important player, will be very important in the Allies' Napoleonic Empire. Are you still with me? Hanging in by a thread. So what happens is that after the divorce, this 13 years, she's finally managed to sort of get rid of the old bag. She's then actually asked to go over to be, because she's the crowned queen, you know, she's asked to go and introduce Marie-Louise into Paris. So she then acts as this, you know, very high-level hostess, I suppose, at this time. And of course, Murat, meanwhile, is overturning everything that she'd actually done in Naples. But this is the time already. By the time we get to the defeat in 1814, you have Murat, who is in the attack of Moscow. Napoleon leaves, gives him supreme command of the army, but Murat leaves as well, because he now has decided that this is the end of the great Napoleonic saga, and that if he wants to maintain his kingship, he's going to have to go over to the enemy. Right? So this is one of the reasons why at the battles that lead up to Napoleon's first defeat, when he goes over to Elba, they will be promoted by the fact that Murat has taken Naples and gone over to the enemy. Now, as I said before, he's very determined to maintain his own crown. Caroline also, at this stage, invites the British in. She has British grand tourists there, she has British nannies, she actually eats so many crumpets, that's why she gets extremely fat, because she goes on a kind of British sort of muffin diet. So what happens, of course, is that when the Allies finally have got rid of Napoleon, he's off in Elba, and they meet to decide what they're going to do with these puppet kingdoms that have existed. And of course, the people who are brought back into power in Paris are the Bourbons, aren't they? Right? And of course, they are the cousins of the Bourbons who used to rule Naples and Sicily. So of course, the Allies aren't going to keep the Murat in power, are they? It was a total illusion. It had all been absolutely for nothing. And so the kingdom is taken away and given back to the Bourbons. Murat leaves Naples to try and get some kind of, you know, backing from the rest of Italy. It's too late now to use Eugène de Beauharnais, who had been Vice King of Italy. And finally, as they lose their crown, Caroline leaves on a British ship and sails off to Italy. So it's really not particularly nice. And at the time, she opens up the port to the British, and this is why they will be able to use that at the time of Waterloo. So she, even more than her husband really, has totally betrayed her brother. She never wanted to lose her crown or her position, and even in her will, she always speaks of herself, I, Caroline, brother of Bonaparte, former queen of Naples and wife of Murat. You know, she never ever sort of speaks of herself in her own right, but her titles. Now, of course, poor old Joachim never managed to sort of come to terms with the fact that he was no longer king. And even though his wife's left, he comes back while Naples is now under the Bourbons and tries to rise, get popular support to rise against them. And he's recognised, well, who wouldn't recognise him? You know, the way in which he gets around in his outfits. You'll see he dresses himself here very much like that Velasquez painting of the King of Spain. You know, these old sort of paintings with him in the breastplate, and sees himself as a great king. He is captured and taken out and court-martialed, and of course is executed, and that's where we get him sort of saying, you know, shoot, you know, go, but leave my face alone. So you have then sort of a portrait of Caroline that she has painted by Ingres, even though she's no longer in Naples, but she has it there in mourning for Murat, to whom she was very attached. They were very attached to each other, even though he had, you know, incredible struggles. And when he finally dies, she sort of, these eccentricities and this strong will goes off sort of in strange directions. So she's very like her brother in many ways. She's sort of always thinking outside the square, ambitious, always sort of manoeuvring, but slightly eccentric. Anyhow, so this is her in widow's, whatever it is, wearing mourning. She works around Italy and finally is allowed to set herself up in Trieste, as indeed Elisa is there. Elisa occupies herself with, she's recovered most of her fortune and does very well actually out of things, and now occupies herself with archaeological digs. Caroline has lost everything. She's lost all. She even has to look after her own children, but manages to call herself the Countess of it's an anagram of Naples, Napoli or Ipola, I think she calls herself. Some extraordinary sort of non-existent place, but she has to have this idea of still being royalty. She had been one of the Bonapartes after all. So the three of them die. Now, first of all, I just wanted to look at this descendant of Murat. Remember that the children actually go and live in Italy, in America, and so Son Altesse Royale, His Royal Highness, Joachim Murat, still got the same name, and still 6'4", and still a bit of a lad. It's really quite interesting how your sort of DNA seems to come down through the generations. And it's not unlike the portraits of his great-great-grandfather. So here we have then these three women who, or the three siblings of Napoleon. Elisa, the strong-willed sort of intellectual, I suppose, cold in her own way, never feeling that she owed Bonaparte much at all. The middle one, Pauline, who really was a threat on the side of public morality, but when it came to the point, was courageous and devoted to her brother, and felt that she, even though she was a princess in her own right and she wasn't going to lose anything as the others would, dedicated her life to helping him when he's finally in exile. And St. Helena, she networks the British. She realises that it's her seduction that will work, and so she gathers in Rome all of the British around her and tries through them to have a better deal for her brother on St. Helena, to get Hudson Lowe removed, for example. So she constantly works. She and her mother are the only two who will. The others abandon him completely. And then, of course, you have Caroline, who will manipulate him through his life, whether it's to get titles for herself, to get rid of Josephine, to have her children recognised as heirs. But finally, this link between her and the history, I suppose, of that last disastrous campaign shows that she probably played the most significant role in his downfall. So the three of them together, strong-willed, active, courageous, but all put together, don't even come up to the ankle of their brother Napoleon. Thank you.